What we've done in the last few weeks, we started with talking about how blind faith was a bad idea. And then we said that rational faith is the only good option. And then we noted that all religions are not the same. In fact, all other religions require blind faith, except for Christianity, which is the only religion that condemns blind faith. Right? Then we noted that if blind faith is bad, then you got to start proving things. The first thing you got to prove is whether God exists, right? And what's very interesting is I have never met an atheist who I proved God existed to that didn't become a Christian. But that's not automatic. Just because God exists, it could be any God. It doesn't mean it's the God of the Bible, right? So the second thing is, even if it's reasonable, rational to believe in God, that doesn't mean Christianity is true. So the second apologetic is prove that the Bible is what the original authors wrote. What we're trying to do is we're trying to focus in and prove that the Bible is true and thus Christianity is true, because the Bible is what attests to Christianity. And then, once we did that, which is what we did last week, so okay, you prove the Bible is what the original authors wrote, but that does not mean it's true. Maybe they made it up, right? Because all we did is we proved that what they wrote 2,000 years ago is what we have today. It doesn't mean that it's true. Maybe it's true, that's what they wrote, but it's all a lie. They were fooled. So the third apologetic is proof that the Bible is true because it's rational and reasonable to believe Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is that we're going to show that the Bible is true and what the apostles said is true because Jesus rose from the dead. And then next week we'll talk about, well, what use was it for Christ to die? Why couldn't God just wave his hand and forgive us all? So next week will be why Christ had to die and why God must punish sin, which is what we're calling the fourth apologetic, but it's actually theology. This is theology, and I remember I told you there's a difference between apologetics and theology. This is theology. And then the last one is, but I have some objections. How can God exist when there's so much evil and suffering in the world? Or / where was God when I was in pain? And so we'll answer that. So, and then we don't have time to do this, but I do talk about, I have all this great info, how do I use it? And then there is a presentation I make, how to talk about this with others without feeling awkward or getting into trouble. I'll give you a summary of it. It's called the Columbo tactic. Did I mention the Columbo tactic? Yeah. It's called the Columbo tactic. You just kind of ask questions and then you lead people into it. Okay, so we have all the options is that there is no God or there is one or more gods, right? So I want to focus on that. So that's what we did the first week. We said, well, no, the no God option is not true. There's one or more gods. Now, it turns out that you can't have one or more gods because you can't have more than one infinite being or one all-powerful being, to be more exact. You could have more infinite beings, but you can't have more than one all-powerful being. So therefore, you really can only have one God. You can't have multiple gods. It just makes no sense. It's not logically possible. So that gives us four options. Either Islam is true, or Judaism is true, or Christianity is true, or there's an unknown God. There's some other religion that we don't know about. All right, you got to consider all of them. You can't just say, oh yeah, this is true. So we've got to consider this as a possibility. Now, Judaism and Christianity are similar. They talk about the same God. And we believe that Christianity is a fulfillment of Judaism, right? And that's what that's what we teach and that's what we preach. So I'm going to combine those two. And so I'm going to get rid of Islam and we're going to get rid of the unknown God. And we're going to focus on Christianity or Judeo-Christianity and see if that's true. Because if that's true, then the unknown God goes away and the Islam goes away, right? So this is how we're going to focus on that. Okay, let's start with this. What was the first time the gospel was hinted at in the Bible? Genesis. Absolutely, Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity, a war between you and the woman and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Did Jesus ever really exist? Was he really God? Did he rise from the dead? So many years ago, I was forced to fly to Israel. Well, there's a bit more to that story. So I was the engineer for a company called C-Cube, which was the first company that ever produced a MPEG encoder. So in those days, an MPEG encoder, that's what takes video, raw video, and converts it into MPEG, which compresses it and allows you to stream it. Well, in those days, the MPEG encoders took 14 chips, and one encoder fit on a board this big. And it was my job to fly around the world teaching people how to design that board and make it, because my company made the chips, and I was the apps engineer, the apps manager, actually. And that was my job, was to fly around and do that. And so I enabled the first MPEG encoder. Just in case you want to know where the original basis for this came from, and I helped Samsung build their very first MPEG player. Except it wasn't called MPEG back then. The reason they wanted it is because Samsung was very big into this new fad, or this fad that had been going around back then, called karaoke. The problem with karaoke is that to sing along with these things is they had these huge video discs, and they were about this big. And every video disc cost about $100. Well, the Japanese businessmen and the Korean businessmen who would go into these karaoke bars were always smashingly drunk when they were handling these discs. And they were breaking these $100 discs. And so all these karaoke bar owners said to Samsung, we love your players, we love your discs, but we can't afford this $100 disc that these drunk people are breaking. So you need to make something smaller, about the size of a CD, because CDs were out there. So they said, okay, well, how do we fit all that information on a CD? We got to compress it. And so we designed the very first compressed video, and it was MPEG video. And then that was then used to make DVDs, right? So that's where the whole origin of the DVD and the size of the DVD came, which, if you don't know, the size of the CD came from the size of the 8-inch floppy disk, if you're old enough to remember. And the reason the 8-inch floppy disk was 8 inches, not 8 inches, sorry, the 5, because before that, the floppy disks were this big and they were really ungainly. So the reason they were this big is because you'll notice they're the size of a cocktail napkin. Because these engineers were sitting in a bar, and they said, we need a smaller floppy disk. What size do you want? Well, how about this cocktail napkin? Oh, there it is. So that was it. And that defined, it's kind of interesting how these things all come together. But anyway, so there I was flying around the world teaching people how to put this thing. And one of our customers was an Israeli company, and they came to California, Silicon Valley, and we had a meeting, and I was, the manager, so I was meeting with all of them. And, as is natural, I take them out to lunch and all that. And while we were at lunch, I said, the main engineer, his name was Asher. I said, Asher, so you're doing this design in Israel? He goes, yeah. I said, well, I think you need to figure out an excuse for me to have to fly to Israel to help you. He goes, I think that can be arranged. So about a week later, I get a call from my boss, and he says, Neil, you're going to have to fly to Israel to help these guys out. I said, oh, man. Okay, I guess I'll do it. And sure enough, so I end up going to Israel, and I land in Tel Aviv. Now, their company is in Tel Aviv, and but Tel Aviv, I have to say this. Sorry if you come from Tel Aviv. I did not think Tel Aviv was a very pretty city. Really kind of hodgepodge city. It was not the most elegant city. And every day I would, we'd work in the lab trying to get this thing working. And I would go back to the hotel at night, and I'd look on the map, and I'd say, man, I want to go to Jerusalem. Well, I'm here stuck in Tel Aviv, right? And so so I said, man, I gotta talk to Asher. So the next day, we're soldering something, trying to get something to work. And I said, Asher, I really want to go to Jerusalem. I mean, we've got to figure out a way for me to get to Jerusalem. But here I'm working all day in the lab, and I go home in the evening. It's kind of late. He goes, yeah. Let's go there for dinner tonight. I'm like, dinner? He says, halfway across the country. He goes, yeah. 45 miles. It should take about an hour and 15 minutes. I'm like, the whole country is 70 miles wide, okay? This is a tiny place. We're not talking, you can't even get out of this county in 70 miles, right? Or maybe this county. But in California, they're huge counties. So so we drove there, and when we got to Jerusalem, I realized, one, how beautiful it is. Everything's made of stone. In fact, if you want to build in the old city, it's got to be made of stone. It can't be made of brick. And I realized that how small the whole town was. In fact, the entire town is less than 3/4 of a mile. And during Jesus' time, it was even less than that. So imagine how long it takes to get from one side of town to the other side in Jesus' time. What, 8 minutes if you're walking and there are no donkeys in your way, You can just walk it, right? And the city wall, as I said, was a lot smaller in Jesus' time. So I finally did get an opportunity to do some sightseeing. They were, they were working me pretty hard. But then they said, "Hey, Yom Kippur is coming up. Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, right? So Yom Kippur is coming up. Nobody works. So you can. We've arranged for an Arab who's not a Jew, so that he doesn't observe the Shabbat. He can take you around and drive you drive you and give you a tour." So I got this private tour in a Mercedes-Benz all throughout Israel. With this Arab guy who I got along famously because I grew up in the Middle East, right? So we were swapping jokes and stuff. And he takes me all around, and he takes me to this one place right there with the red star is. And I walk in there, and this is Yom Kippur, right? So everybody is, there are people from all over the world there. And I walk into this place, and and they won't let you in unless you have a little kippah, right? Yarmulke, kippah, yarmulke. And so I don't have one. I don't wear a hat. So they give me a little piece of cardboard, and I look like Hardy, Lauren Hardy. I look like Hardy walking like this tiny little hat on my head. And I go in there, and there are these people doing, these Jewish people saying prayers, a lot of tourists from all over the world. And I said, I asked my guide, I said, "So what is this place?" He says, "Oh, this is King David's tomb, right? And this is the traditional spot of King David's tomb." And I said, "Who are all these people?" He said, "Oh, some of them are tourists, but a lot of them are also Jews from other parts of the world that have come here for Yom Kippur." So it was a very fascinating time. Anyway, so, as I mentioned, I was born at a very early age, and being a son of a Marxist and a scientist and an atheist, and coming from a family of Christians and atheists, I always ask myself, why am I a Christian? And so the question becomes more important when people die. Am I a Christian, and why do I believe in Christianity? Is it because I want to believe in the afterlife? Is death the end game? And is it just because I don't want to believe in death that I'm embracing Christianity? All different cultures have ways to deal with death. The Mexicans have the Day of the Dead. Dios del, what's it called? Dia de los Muertos, right? And all different groups and traditions have just to deal with death because they don't want to face death. So my question was, is Christianity the same thing? Oh yeah, we don't want to face death. We're going to come up with a savior, a resurrection thing. And is it real? And so you've heard this passage before. 1 Peter 3:15 says, "You better know it's real." In fact, not only should you know it's real, you should be able to tell other people why it's real, because it says, "Always be prepared to give an apologia to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." And that word apologia is defense or explanation. So this is not a suggestion. This is a command. It says, always be prepared. We are commanded to be prepared. And so apologetics, as we mentioned, is the evidence and defense of the rational faith of Christianity using facts, logic, history, science, philosophy, and reasoning. Christianity, as I mentioned, isn't a blind faith, right? It's a rational faith built on a solid historical foundation. So this is the premise that we have. And in line with that, as I mentioned, we have these six things that we do. Prove that faith should never be blind. Prove God exists without using the Bible. Prove the New Testament is accurate, which we've done. And today, prove God exists and explain why Christ died, why God was punished sin, right? So these are the things that we're supposed to be doing. Now, if you've been here for so long, you have with me established the following. It's more rational to think that blind faith is dangerous. That an all-powerful God exists using science. So this is just a summary for you so you understand it, that the supernatural exists using science, and the Bible was transmitted correctly and is accurate, right? So we know that much. So now that we're looking at Christianity, let me ask you this. Most other religions, you don't need the founder of the religion for the religion to exist. For instance, for Buddhism, there are no writings of Buddha, but they have his teachings. And so if Buddha turned out to be a legend tomorrow, you still have Buddhism, and it would be fine. Islam, Muhammad said, "Never pray to me, you should listen to what I said." And so in Islam, it's even if Muhammad didn't exist, but you had the Quran, you could still be a Muslim, right? So you can go through all that. In Hinduism, of course, they don't even think that after gods existed. It's again the teachings of that. So the question is Christianity based on the teaching of Jesus just like all the other religions? No. Why? Because did Jesus come to teach us the way? It's a complex question. He didn't come to teach us only the way, because Christianity is based not only on the teaching of Jesus, but on the what? The blood of Jesus. If there was no blood, there is no redemption of sin. If there is no redemption of sin, there is no salvation. If there's no salvation, there is no Christianity. In that case, all we have is a social gathering, right? And as somebody said, why would I want to be a part of a church? I can get better mileage out of being part of the Rotary Club, right? And so we have to understand why, if Christianity is true, and so therefore, if Christianity is not true, then everything falls apart, unlike Islam, unlike all those other things. And what's interesting is we see all these other religions, these fake Christian religions, or denominations that have devolved into, oh, Jesus is just a good teacher, and you see them dying. I mentioned briefly that we have this thing called mychurchfinder.org, allows you to find a good church. And it's growing rapidly, but when we did the research for that, we found that churches that had gone to the alternative Jesus have lost 50% of their membership. Churches that have embraced the real Jesus, or are pushing the real Jesus, teaching the real and standing strong in their faith, have grown 175%. And this was before COVID. Now, after COVID, the churches that stayed open have been growing, like our church grew by almost 3,000%. Right? So there were 250, not 3,000, 1,000%. There were 250 people, and we left, there were 3,500 people. So why? Because they stayed open, and they were leading people to Christ constantly. So did Jesus come only to show us the way to God? No. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He did not come to show us the way. He came to be the way. And this is, I think, very important about Christianity, because a lot of people don't realize that, and whenever they try to subvert the gospel, then they have nothing special. As I said, why not join the Rotary Club? Okay, so 1 Corinthians 15:12 says that there is no resurrection of the dead, and Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain, and we of all people to be pitied. So they go one step further. Not only did Jesus say he had to be the way, he had to what? He had to rise from the dead. It wasn't enough that he said, I am the way. He had to what? He had to prove that he is the way. And so that is the focus that we have today. So our first focus is, one, why is Jesus different from the other good teachers? Well, we just already explained that. Two, did Jesus really exist? And three, did he really rise from the dead? Okay. Now, I play this little game, and we will talk if Jesus really exists. Why is different from, oh, we already did this. Okay, so how many of you here think Jesus is only talked about in the Bible and nowhere else? Now, this doesn't really work after I did the one session before, because you know the answer, right? But a lot of times when I teach this, people are like, oh, yeah, he's only talked about in the Bible. How many think Jesus was never mentioned by other historians? I've had people come and say, well, how come Jesus is never mentioned by any of the historians around that time? And I go, well, he was. And then they go, no. What I mean is, how come he wasn't written about by historians who lived at the same time he did? Because all the historians comes years later. Well, yeah, because he died and risen from the dead. So why would they report on some schmuck in Jerusalem, right, that didn't do anything special? Until he did that special, and what did he do? He had to rise again to be special. So, and then how many have evidence to prove Jesus was not just a legend and that he actually existed? So if you need to be able to have that evidence. So we'll start with simply talking about the evidence that we've actually mentioned before, was Cornelius Tacitus, or Tacitus. He says, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one our procurator, Pontius Pilate. Right? So we have the evidence that here was Jesus, who was crucified during the reign of Tiberius by Pontius Pilate. And then we have Josephus. Josephus is a very interesting guy. If you ever get a chance to read his writings, it's fascinating, tragic, fascinating, because he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. But he says this, he says, Ananias the high priest convened a meeting of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and so in others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. Now this, of course, is James, the brother of Jesus, as we mentioned last week, not James, the brother of John, who was mentioned in Acts. Okay, now what's really interesting about this is that we have more reliable historical sources for Jesus than we have for Tiberius Caesar, right? Who was the emperor during Jesus' time. So, and one of these sources, Tacitus, talks about both of them together. So it's the same source that gives you evidence for both of that. So we know that Jesus really lived, and I think when I first came to the States, I had not, I'd grown up in a Christian home because my dad had become a Christian when I was about 5, abandoned atheism. But I would go home to India all the time and get into arguments with my atheist cousins and everything. But I never really considered the historical evidence, the fact that Jesus was a real human being, had real flesh and real blood, until I ran into this passage with James. And I'm like, wow, he was a real human being. And I think a lot of times people don't realize that this is out there. And of course, there are other Suetonius, Pliny, Italus, and the Talmuds, which we explained last time we did the class. Okay, so let's talk about if he really rose from the dead. And this is important. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, then we really don't need to fear death. And death is a real issue, as I mentioned. One atheist argument against God is the fact that babies die. Children die. Innocent people are killed in tornadoes or in war. And they say this proves that a good God can exist, which we'll address. But you start here with this resurrection. An atheist once asked in a debate with William Lane Craig, he said, what do you say to a child who is dying? Do you say, you poor child, God has ordained that you will die of this disease, and he doesn't care enough to save you? Tough. So the question is death our final destiny? Is death the victor in the end? Life, the end of love, the end of hope? In the words of the poet, is death so complete and the grave an impossible potion to beat? If there is no resurrection of the dead, and if Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain, and we of all people are to be pitied. Did we come up with the resurrection story to calm our fears? This is the repeating theme that you're going to hear. Is the resurrection story true, or is it a myth that we created to pacify our fear? Jesus claimed to be God. But anyone can claim to be God, right? In fact, we've got lots of people claiming to be God. Other people claim to be God. Why should I believe that Jesus is really God? Why should I believe that I'll see my mother again or my loved ones again? Why should I believe that? Why should I believe that I need not be scared of death? Why should I believe in the resurrection of the dead and eternal life? Well, did Jesus prove he was God? And here's how he did that. You see, something happened 2,000 years ago that changed the entire course of history. Some inexplicable occurrence took place, and mankind has never been the same. In fact, I do a class where I draw a line in history between pre-Christ and post-Christ, and you can see the massive changes that has happened as a result of that. But something happened. That one mystery changed history. And something so unusual happened that it motivated a handful of scared fishermen to leave everything that they loved and to go out into the most dangerous corners of the world and get killed. And one of them came to India and converted my ancestors. And that mystery that changed history was the empty grave. Right? And mankind has yet not been able to explain how the grave came to be empty. So we are going to be detectives. We're going to put on detective hats, and we're going to figure out how that grave came to be empty. My friend, Detective J. Warner Wallace, very famous detective. He's been on all the big shows, 60 Minutes, 48 Hours. And he says he's done all these cold case detective cases that he's solved and basically caught the murderer 20 years later, right? Now the thing about a cold case is that most often everybody is dead except for perhaps the murderer. The parents of the victim are dead. The victim, of course, is dead. Even the prosecuting attorney is dead. The detective that was in charge of it is dead. So a lot of times this is it. And Jim is actually very good at that. And he would go in when he was still working for the LAPD. He would actually go in and find these cases and then solve them and then be on TV because he had solved them. So he said this. He said, you know what? There's a difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. Direct evidence supports the truth of an assertion directly without need for any additional evidence and inference. You can use, because he's using big language here. Circumstantial evidence is evidence that relies on an inference to connect it to a conclusion of fact. Example, forensic evidence, like the fingerprint of a scene of a crime. So I said, well, Jim, is how many of these, I thought always circumstantial evidence was kind of flaky evidence. He said, no, actually, most murder case convictions come from circumstantial evidence. I mean, it makes sense because, how many people are going to murder somebody else in front of a bunch of other people? The only evidence you're going to have is, the smoking gun, people heard him screaming, heard somebody running, saw somebody running, You want to know who did what, but you weren't there, so you got to look at all the evidence around it. So he said, in fact, some people have even been freed by circumstantial evidence. So back to the empty grave. Nobody that was there is still alive. This is a cold case, as he puts it. He's written a book about it. So we have to look at the circumstantial evidence. Now, the first evidence you're going to ask me for, and you should if you're thinking, is, right? I mean, I can't just jump into it and say, well, the grave was empty. Well, let me turn that question around. If the grave wasn't empty and if the body of Christ was still in the grave, how long would the story of Jesus' resurrection have lasted? What was the fundamental crux of Christianity? Not the teachings of Jesus, but the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, proving he was God, right? See, remember this slide? If there is no resurrection of the dead and Christ does not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain. We of all people are to be pitied. In other words, if Jesus is not rise from the dead, then Christians are deluded fools. So let me ask you this. Let's say it's AD 33, about 3 months after Jesus had been crucified, and you want to stop the religion of Christianity. A lot of people wanted to. The Jews wanted to. The Romans wanted to. Everybody and their monkey wanted to. What would be the easiest thing in the world for you to do to kill this religion? Well, go find the body, show it to everybody, and you're done, right? And the apostles weren't preaching the story in Rome, 1,300 miles away. They were preaching the story where? In downtown Jerusalem, a huge metropolis of Jerusalem that would take you hours to get across. No, it would take you how long to get across? 8 minutes, if you walk slow, right? Now, in the Bible, we find the Apostle Peter's very first evangelistic talk in Acts 2. Here's what happens. It's the Passover feast. And what happens when you have these feasts? Jews from all over the world come into town. Oh, hey, that reminds me of Yom Kippur, right? Everybody's coming into town. But guess what? They're all from different countries, and they don't all speak Hebrew. Some of them speak other languages. And so, that's natural. I don't speak any Indian languages. So when I go to India, I have to talk to my cousins in English, right? Because I never learned my mother tongue. My parents speak it, but I don't, right? So it's the same way. Kids, people who've emigrated, they speak the local languages. They come back to Israel like, oh, we don't know Hebrew. So somebody's got to translate. Well, sir, here's Peter. He's going to preach to all of them, but he's going to preach in what? In Aramaic, right? Well, there's a problem there. They're not going to understand. But then the night before, something amazing happened. What happened? We had the day of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit came down, and all of a sudden, all the apostles seemed to be able to speak in different languages. These are real languages. They're not made-up languages. They don't repeat the same syllable 5 times, right? And they're out there. And so they are standing out, and they start to translate what Peter's saying. So Peter's talking to a whole mass of people where? In downtown Jerusalem, probably close to the temple, right? So here's what he says. He says, God raised Jesus from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, for God would not allow the Holy One to undergo decay. I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. What tomb is he talking about? The tomb of David that I went to see 2,000 years later, right? And he says, I can tell you confidently the patriarch David died and was buried in his tomb, and his tomb is here today. And then he goes on, but Christ was not abandoned to the grave, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are what? Witnesses to this fact. So there is David's tomb in Jerusalem, outside the city walls, and there is Jesus' grave. How? It's actually closer than David's grave. Right? It's still outside the city walls, but it's closer. So there's David's tomb, and that's where we think the tomb of Jesus is. Now let me ask you this. Let's say someone famous, pick a celebrity, had died, and then a few days later, 40 days later, a bunch of people show up and say, hey, this person has risen from the dead. And he's buried in the parking lot, 8-minute walk from here. Now, how many of you, even if you didn't believe him, the least would go, yeah, right, let's go check it out? How many people became Christians that day? 3,000 people became Christians that day. Now, I'm guaranteeing you that nobody from another country is going to come and say, oh, yeah, he rose from the dead, I'm just going to believe that. I'm going to go check out that tomb. And everybody who was able to walk would go. In fact, it probably didn't take 8 minutes because of the thousands of people who went there. Probably took 25 minutes now. Because you're like, hey, get out of the way, man. I'm trying to see. Oh, so are we. Get in line, right? The fact is that it makes no sense that Christianity would survive that very first gospel presentation if the grave was not empty. Okay, Dr. Gary Habermas, a great historian, apologist, did this exercise. He surveyed 30 years of German, French, and English critical scholarship relating to Jesus' resurrection. He amassed a list of 2,200 sources, and he identified 12 facts which are considered historical by a large majority of skeptical and conservative experts. He actually has reduced this down to 5 facts. He says, I don't need the 12 facts, I can do it with 5 facts. I like the 12 facts, it's easier. But he said, these are the 12 facts. So they are, one, that Jesus died by crucifixion. Well, we know that. Tacitus tells us that. Josephus tells us that. A bunch of people, right? 2, Jesus was buried. We know that. These are all, again, facts non-Christian and Christian historians accept. Jesus caused the disciples to despair and lose hope, believing that his life was ended. The tomb was discovered to be empty just a few days later. The disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Christ. The disciples were transformed from doubters afraid to identify themselves with Christ to bold proclaimers of the resurrection. The resurrection message was the center of preaching at the early church. This message was especially proclaimed where Jesus died and was buried shortly before. Number 9, as a result of this preaching, the entire church was founded and grew. Number 10, Sunday became the day of worship instead of the Sabbath, right? James, a brother of Christ, a skeptic, was converted to the faith when he believed he saw the risen Jesus. He was then executed for his faith. Josephus tells us that, right? Paul, a persecutor of Christianity, was also converted by experience, which he likewise believed to be appearance of the resurrected Jesus. So these are the 12 minimal facts. Now, if we are about to investigate how the tomb came to be empty, we have to look at every possible scenario of how it could have happened, right? Well, there are 2 ways the tomb could be empty. The natural means or the supernatural means. Now, we are positing the supernatural means, but we can't jump to that. We're detectives. We've got to look at the whole thing. So we've got to first look at every single natural means and see if the probable is impossible. If the probable is impossible, then what? The improbable must be possible. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to understand this, and we have to look at how these things work. So the first thing is, the first most obvious one, and I think most people agree, is that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. Right? Most obvious one. Most people would say, yeah, the tomb was empty, but the disciples stole the body. Well, here's the problem. It's the easiest claim to disprove, right? Now, I throw this fact in. This is not one of the minimal facts, but I throw in the fact that the tomb was most probably guarded. And it makes a lot of logical sense that the tomb was guarded. Why? Because the Jews went to Pilate and said, this guy said he was going to rise from the dead. We've got to do something about it. His followers are going to what? Steal the body and claim he rose from the dead. You better put some guards out there. Now, why didn't the Jews put their own guards on him? They had guards. Well, here's the problem. Jesus was what kind of a prisoner? He was a Roman prisoner. He was executed by the Romans. Therefore, his body was, in a sense, the property of the Roman government, and if anybody took the body, it was their problem. So they had jurisdiction, and Pilate was like, yeah, go ahead, you have your guard. So he sends out the Roman guards. Now, the Roman guard unit was given, Polybius was a Greek historian. He says the Roman guard unit was probably 16 men. They were professional killers. This is a real picture. Color technology was really good back then. And they were professional killers trained to protect the entire battalion from what they were guarding. So let's say they were guarding something or a person, like a delegate or a diplomat or whatever they were guarding, they were trained to guard it with their lives. Because if they lost what they were guarding, they would die. So it was an incentive to die honorably than die at the hands of one of your own fellow soldiers. So whatever guarding, they were guarding with their life. This is how it would happen, is they would start in front of the tomb, but not all of them at the same time. Only 4 would be in front of the tomb at any given time. The rest of the soldiers would be relaxing. The other 12 soldiers would relax in a semicircle. And if they did sleep, they would sleep with their heads on the inside, so you couldn't bash their heads in and attack them, right? So this is the thing. So the disciples, let's say the disciples decide they want to attack. Now remember, the disciples are trained fishermen. Oh no, there is a tax collector there. So 10 trained fishermen and a tax collector. There were zealots and all that too. But anyway, so they would have to make a frontal assault to the thing. First of all, they have to dispense with the 12 sleeping guards, maybe bash their feet because their heads are on the inside. And then they do a frontal assault onto the 4 soldiers. They move into the sepulchre. They move the stone, which would be a problem, take them, slow them down sometime, grab the body of Jesus, and then head out. Right? How many people are going to bet on the disciples? No? Somebody said, well, what if there were like 500 of them? I'm like, yeah. And then how quickly would that story spread? I mean, if it was going to be the disciples, it better be only the core group. In fact, you really probably only wanted 3 of the disciples to do that, because the other disciples might talk, especially if they were going to die. Well, here's the problem with this. Every single one of the disciples, except for one, met gruesome fate. Peter was crucified upside down. Andrew was crucified. Simon was crucified. The first James was beheaded. That's the brother who was one of, and then the brother of John was sought alive. Brother John was beheaded. The second James was sought alive in pieces. Bartholomew was flayed alive with knives. Thomas goes to India, converts my ancestors, gets speared. Jude was killed by arrows. Matthew was killed in Ethiopia. Philip killed in Neapolis. In addition, 2 other potential plotters, James, the brother of Jesus, was stoned to death, and Paul, the spread of the gospel, first hated the Christians and then became one and was executed in Rome for it. So all these people who had anything maybe to gain from it died horrible deaths. Now, we can only verify historically about 4 of them, but the rest are from church fathers and secular historians, right? So pretty much we know that they all suffered. And John was the only one who did not execute it. And he got exiled, and he got beaten, he got all that, and finally he dies in exile. Okay, so here's a question. Do we see this scene happening? Peter, okay, so here's the plan. We fight the guards, we get the body out of the tomb and stash it somewhere, and then we come back and we tell a story that probably will have us hunted, hated, whipped, stoned, poor, powerless, and finally get us all killed. And we never change our minds. So who's with me on this? I mean, it just doesn't happen that way, right? And the fundamental basis for all their death sentences was precisely because they claimed that Jesus was God and rose from the dead. Nobody was out there to kill them because they claimed that Jesus said you should love your neighbor, right? Love was not the message. You know, somebody said, well, Jesus' only message is love. I'm like, really? You're going to go around killing people because they want you to love people? I've never heard that happen before. I mean, it sounds very noble, but it's just not true. It just doesn't happen. Jesus was killed for a lot more. He was killed by the Jews for claiming to be God. He was killed by the Romans for claiming to be the only God, because the Romans had a pantheon of gods. Like if the Christians had said, oh yeah, here's another God, just to add to Zeus and Hercules and everybody else, I mean, they would have been happy, right? But no, he was the only God, and they did not like that. And then he was also killed by the Romans because they claimed that Caesar was not God. And then they were killed by every other polytheistic religion for claiming that Jesus was the only way. And none of the disciples recanted their stories. Right? And so the minimal facts refutes the stolen theory by 5 of these minimal facts. I won't go over each one of them because it'll take us too long, but I'll just show them up there. Okay. So the next option is the wrong tomb. Maybe they didn't steal the body, maybe they're just mistaken, they went to the wrong tomb, right? So here's the real tomb, here's the wrong tomb, and, first Peter goes to the wrong tomb, and then John gets it. Actually, John notices that John said, both of us ran, but I got there first. Yeah, thanks, John. You were probably about 30 years younger than Peter at the time. So I don't wonder you got there first. But he gets there first, and then out of respect, he lets Peter step in. But they went to the wrong tomb. And then they came out of the tomb and go, oh, he's risen. So the women went to the wrong tomb. Peter and John went to the wrong tomb, and then what were the guards doing? Were they guarding the right tomb, saying, oh, look at these crazy people. They think somebody's risen from the dead, but we're right here. Hey, hi. Unless the guards were guarding the wrong tomb, which would be really, really weird. Right? Now, of course, later on, Joseph of Arimathea shows up. What's all this ruckus, Wait, which tomb did I bury Jesus at? Was it this one or that one? No, people didn't have two tombs. They had only one tomb. You don't think Joseph of Arimathea, who is a Christian, becomes a Christian, stays a Christian, would know which tomb he'd buried. And besides, if you buried someone that you loved, would you forget where they were buried? Seems very difficult. So I don't think the wrong tomb. Besides, it's also refuted by a bunch of the same minimal facts. In fact, a bunch more minimal facts here. Okay, so let's look at the next one. What about it was moved by the Jews of the Romans? That's possible. But here's the question. If the Jews had removed the body, how would they have ended this religion that they hated? Produce the body, or just say, no, we moved the body. But instead, what were they saying? No, you stole the body. Now, why say that you stole the body if you had the body? Somebody tried to suggest, well, maybe it was because they illegally moved the body. I'm like, yeah, really? Come on. Yeah. You were unclean. Yeah. But anyway, so the real problem was nobody seemed to know what happened to the body. They were all running around blaming everybody else. So the minimal facts kind of refute that. And also, it's revealed by the fact that disciples had experiences of the risen Jesus. So the next one possibility is that it was hallucination. Some people suggested that everybody hallucinated. Peter hallucinated. Paul hallucinated. Mary hallucinated. Peter, Paul, and Mary wrote a song about that. Because they all got stoned. Stephen got stoned. Paul got stoned. James got stoned. It was a different kind of stoning at that time. It's not the kind of stoning they're thinking about, right? The problem is that more than 500 people saw Jesus after he had risen. And psychologists tell you that even if two people see the exact same thing, it's not a hallucination because you can't replicate what somebody else is seeing in their mind. And this wasn't some strange bright light in the sky or a mold on a water tower that resembled Jesus. We weren't talking about, I saw an apparition. No, they said we saw him, we talked to him, we touched him, we ate with him, and we spent 40 days with him. And then they went out and died for those claims. So again, the hallucination theory just doesn't work, and it's refuted by a bunch of the minimal facts because they had real experiences. Okay. And then, of course, there's the twin theory. It's called the Dave theory by William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig, as I said, is a great debater. And he was debating now get this, an expert in the New Testament, an atheist professor who's an expert in the New Testament, Robert Greg Cavan. Now, this is what cracks me up. Calvin is so knowledgeable of the New Testament. He says there is no way that Jesus rose from the dead, but there's only one way to explain it. And so he comes up with the twin theory, which you can guess. The movie Dave, if you saw the movie Dave, I got to get rid of this because a lot of kids are like, what? Dave looks just like the president, and so he replaces the president. So that's the theory, the Dave theory. And William Lane Craig mocks the theory in the debate using Dave. So here's the theory, the twin theory. See, there's a problem with the twin theory. If Jesus was a twin, his mother would have known. His brother would have known, right? And his brother leads the church. In fact, half the people in the town of Bethlehem would be like, or Nazareth, were like, yeah, Jesus and his twin, So that would not work. So it could only work if Jesus had a twin that nobody knew about, including his mother and his brother. So Calvin comes up with the theory of this. He says, see, Jesus is in Bethlehem. He's just been born, and he's a baby, and he's in the dark cave in the manger. But right next to him is a couple with two twins, and for fun, I call them Jeter and Dieter. And in the darkness of the cave, somehow, Dieter gets swapped with Jesus. Now, Dieter and Jeter are identical twins. Now, I'm trying to imagine how this happened. So maybe Mary is holding Jesus, and she comes back to the wrong manger and puts him in the manger and goes, oh, wait, no, that's the other manger. Here, I'll take him. And she turns around, turns back, and meanwhile, Jesus moved, picks up Dieter, and takes Dieter and puts him back in the other manger. I'm like, this is like really, how many people are buying this? Now, it gets even weirder because, so what happens is, they go off, the twins, who are not identical twins anymore, go off, live their life somewhere else. Dieter, who everybody thinks is Jesus, goes back to Nazareth, has this whole thing, decides he's the Messiah, gets crucified. One fine day, on the day of the crucifixion, the two brothers, there's Dieter, who got swapped with Jesus' birth and thinks he's Jesus, is crucified. The two twin brothers, who aren't identical anymore because they don't look alike at all, are walking through Jerusalem, or into Jerusalem, and the real Jesus, who thinks he's Dieter, who looks nothing like his supposed twin Dieter, they're walking there and they go, see this guy on the cross. And Jesus says to Dieter, hey, dude, that guy looks just like you. In fact, he looks more like your twin than I am. I know I'm your twin, but I don't look anything like you, but that guy does. And so Dieter, who notices the man on the cross looks just like him, decides to pretend he's Jesus, risen from the dead. How many are buying this? Oh, come on. Don't you see it's the only way to explain it? And so he shows up and he says, hey, I'm Jesus. You must be Mary. No, I'm Martha. Oh, you must be James. No, I'm Jude. You don't even know your own brother, man. He's like, what was that thing that you told us about? Oh, I don't remember any of that stuff. How long will it fly? I mean, come on. Would you know your own son? Even if he was a twin, you're like, oh, this guy looks a lot like Jesus, but he ain't Jesus. Right? And then what does it take for James, his brother, to believe that his brother is God? If you have a brother, what does it take? What would it take to convince you that your brother is God? The guy shows up and looks like the brother that died and can't do any miracles that he used to do. I mean, the concept just gets more ludicrous as it goes on. And besides, it's refuted by the fact that James, the brother of Jesus, as I said, was converted through faith. Okay, so the day theory doesn't work. So we're left with one last theory. And again, we can go through all of these. Whenever I do this when I do it in 2 weeks, we actually, the first session of the second week is all the groups get together and they have to come up with a theory of how the grave came to be empty that doesn't violate any of the minimal facts. That's a game. And I play with kids all the time. The kids have a lot of fun with it. But they've never been able to come up with a working, and then they have to come and present their theory, and all the other kids get to tell them why their theory doesn't work. It's a lot of fun. We all have a lot of fun. We get all sorts of weird things like, aliens did it, or this did it. And then some kid will say, well, hang on, and then they'll explain why the whole alien plot doesn't work, right? So what we're left with is the swoon theory. And this one, if you have to think about it, is probably closest to what a lot of skeptics think. They think it was a swoon. He was swooned. Or they think he swooned. I mean, the idea is, well, maybe he was not dead. Maybe he fainted. Or maybe somebody gave him a drug, like in Romeo and Juliet, where everybody thought he was dead. And then somebody said, well, Romans didn't know anything about medicine and death. Maybe Jesus was just in a coma. Some guy even wrote a book about it called The Passover Plot. The sad thing is that most people never bother to happen. So to understand this, we have to understand the crucifixion. So it all starts that night in the upper room, where Jesus says, this is my blood poured out for you for the forgiveness of sin, right? And then later that night, he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane in the Mount of Olives. And if you remember, Luke 22:44 says, and in being in anguish, he prayed even more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Now, many people are predisposed to say, well, this is just figurative language, colorful language. But it's not creative language. It's something called hematidrosis. This is an affliction associated with high psychological stress. You see, what happens is severe anxiety causes the release of internal chemicals that break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. And as a result, you bleed into the glands, and when you sweat, the sweat comes out tinged with blood. Right? And it also has the unfortunate side effect of making the skin so fragile that it becomes very sensitive and tender, and at times painful to the touch. Jesus was in great mental anguish, and yet at the moment he suffers from hematidrosis. This is even more heartbreaking in that the next day Jesus was to experience 39 lashes with his skin already in this ready-to-eat state. History tells us that the Roman 39 lashes were made from were done with a whip or braided leather tongs. When the whip would strike the flesh, the balls would cause deep bruises and the bones would cut severely. If the soldier doing the whipping was in an extra foul mood, the cuts and intensity of the whipping would shred the back so much that the spine of the victim was sometimes exposed. One physician who studied Roman beatings said as the flogging continued, the lash patients would tear into the underlying muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Eusebius, a 3rd century historian, says the sufferer's veins were laid bare and the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. Isaiah 53:5 was written 700 years before Christ, says he was beaten for our transgressions and by his stripes we were healed. Now, as a result of this, Jesus goes into what was called hypovolemic shock. It's shock caused by a low volume of blood. So what happens with hypovolemic shock is the heart races to try and pump blood, which isn't there because he's been bleeding. Blood pressure drops, causing fainting or collapsing. The kidney stops producing urine to try and maintain what liquid is left in the body, and the person becomes extremely thirsty as the body craves fluids to replace the lost blood volume. And as a result of that, your mouth is completely dry. Psalm 22:15 says, my strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. And this explains why Jesus said what? He says, after this, Jesus said, I thirst. He's on the cross, and he's thirsty. Now remember, as he goes to the cross, he stumbles. And Simon the Cyrene has to pick up the cross. Why? Because he's suffering from hypovolemic shock. He's getting faint. When Jesus gets to Golgotha, the place where he's to be crucified, the soldiers tied his arms and legs to the cross and then nailed him. But they weren't nailed in the palms, as so many pictures show. They were actually nailed right here. Because if you nail in the palms, they'll just rip right out. And their hands had a very important function, as we'll see in a minute. So what they would do, they would nail right through this nerve right here. It's the median nerve right between the two bones. You can push it right here, and you'll feel it. It's almost like the funny bone. It's the nerve that runs through your funny, that causes the funny bone. And what happens is, if you squeeze it, it causes great pain, just like if somebody was squeezing your funny bone nerve. And so the Romans knew that. And they wanted to create great pain because they would use a median nerve and nail right through it, which would be equivalent to taking a pair of pliers and squeezing your ulnar nerve, which is your funny bone nerve. And this pain would last until the nerve was torn to shreds. And the pain was so unbearable that they created a brand new word for this pain. And the word is excruciating, which means out of the cross. And then they do the same with his other hand and then his feet. They found a crucified victim from the 1st century, and they noticed that the victim had been buried by his family, and they noticed that there was a nail right through his heel. So Jesus would have a nail that pierced right through his heel. Does this remind you of something? And then another prophecy, they pierced my hands and my feet. You know, crucifixion, this was written 900 years before Christ. Crucifixion had not been invented yet. It wouldn't be invented until the Romans came to power. And crucified victims, immediately, they were meant to suffer and then die so that people would walk by, see them suffering, and say, I'm never going to cross the road. Now, when Jesus' wrists were nailed, as we know from the archaeological finds of crucified victims, they would have pulled his shoulders out of their sockets. And what that does is that now he can't use his arms. His arms are stuck up here. He can't use his arms to raise himself up because he's sitting here. But what he has to do is he has to push himself up on the nail. Well, why would he have to push himself up? Because when you're hanging like this, all your weight's on there. You can't breathe because your chest is in an expanded position. So to breathe, you have to release the pressure in your lungs, and you have to push up on your thing with the pain. You have to grab a breath, and then the pain in your legs will force you to drop back down again to release that pain. And you can't use your arms to help you with that, which is why the arms had to be pulled out of its socket. And the Bible says, again, 900 years before Christ, my bones are out of joint. A prophecy of a crucifixion, as I said, had not been invented. Then they would raise the cross and drop it in a stand, and then Jesus would fall forward, which would make even the work of getting up even more hard. Now, so If you recall, the soldiers came by and they broke the legs of the two thieves next to them because the next day was a Shabbat. Why do you think they did that? So they will die. Because if your legs are broken, you can't push yourself up to take a breath. Now, you can't pretend you're dying, you're dead. You can't just pretend you're dead, because what? To take that breath, you have to do a large muscle movement. So if you were in a coma on the cross, what would happen to you? You would die. In fact, that would probably be the best thing that could happen to you, is because you would die right away, right, without suffering. So the question is, did Jesus die, or did he swoon and they thought he was dead? We obviously didn't swoon. He must, if he was on the cross not moving, he would be dead. Well, an analysis by a medical doctor, because we're talking, well, how did he die? I mean, they came to break his legs. He was already dead. So how did he really die? Well, a medical doctor that I read has a theory. He says what happens is, after all this is going through, because he was beaten and most prisoners were not beaten before they were crucified, is that his blood goes in some sort of a shock. And because it goes into the shock, it can't clot. So it can't stop bleeding. And so basically the flow of blood continues, and Jesus on the cross is just bleeding profusely, and he dies of a massive blood loss as his blood pours out. Isaiah 53:6 says, "And we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned out one to his own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the sin of us all." And Jesus was dead. There's no way he could have survived that. There's no evidence that he could have survived it. A coma makes no sense whatsoever. And then darkness covers the land. Luke says, it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour, and the sun was darkened. Matthew says, then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split. This, Matthew and Luke were supposedly, according to skeptics, just saying that because they wanted to match this prophecy of Joel, written 540 years before Christ. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For on Mount Sinai and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance. They said, look, see, Matthew and Luke were just creating this because if you look at the astronomical charts, we can plot the planets and the stars and everything. You can see that there was no eclipse on that time, anywhere in those years. You can calculate there is no eclipse there. So there's no record of any eclipse. So did they make this up? Well, it wasn't an eclipse, but something happened, because if you read Phlegon Trellinus, he's recorded in his History of the Olympiads. The guy's not a Christian. He's not even talking about Christ. He's talking about the Olympics. And he says this: in the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, AD 33, a failure of the sun took place, greater than any previously known. And night came on at the 6th hour of the day. That's noon, because they would start 6 o'clock as 1, and then would go up from there. 6th hour of the day. So the stars actually appeared in the sky, and a great earthquake took place in Bithynia and overthrew a greater part of Nicaea. This not only gives us the date, 33 AD, it gives us a portion of the world that was covered in darkness and the earthquake that happened. This is a pretty big earthquake. So Jesus was dead, and the prophecies had been fulfilled. Roman historians tell us that no less than 4 executioners had to confirm the death of a crucified victim. And as we've seen, the Romans were very intimate with every form of death and torturing and prolonged it. Furthermore, if a crucified victim were to show up in the marketplace a few days later, guess who would replace him on the cross? The executioner, right? So they would make sure that he was dead, and one of the ways they make sure is they would come up and they pierced him with a spear, see if he flinches. So you get a spear all the way through into your heart. What happens? Well, the Roman centurion pierces Jesus' side with the spear, and blood and water gushes out. Now, not knowing anything else but this fact, a doctor can tell you immediately that the victim was dead. Why? The technical reason, the heart has stopped, which results in collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart, which is called pericardial effusion, as well as the collection of fluid around the lungs, which is called pleural effusion. This can't happen if the heart is still beating. You could get separation of the fluids in your leg, because if you've got gangrene or you've got no circulation in your leg, yeah, liquid coming out. But when it happens around the chest cavity, that means the heart is not beating. You can't have the heart beating everywhere else in the brain and not be in the chest cavity. So the fact that you have the separation of this really waxy liquid, the person's heart was not beating. Well, I definitely don't think John knew about it. Yeah. Why would the fusion and what looked like blood and what looked like the waxy liquid separate? And why would a fisherman know it, right? So, but given all this, and here's the great thing: given all this, the destruction of the swoon theory is given by an atheist, strangely enough, named David Strauss. David Strauss is a doctor, and he says this. He says, look, it's impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill, wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, could have given to the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life, an impression which lay at the bottom of the future ministry. Look, Josephus accounts for 3 men who were crucified, who are his friends. And he goes to the Roman centurion. He says, these men are my friends. Take them down immediately. And they do. 2 of them still die, but 1 survives. So it was not unheard of for people to be crucified and survive. But I want you to imagine this. So there's Peter, James, and John. They're sitting and hiding somewhere. Suddenly the knock comes on the door. Jesus has happened to wake up in the tomb. He pushes away he's walking on holes in his legs, and he's got he pushes away the tomb somehow. Maybe he scares the Roman centurion, right? Like, oh, look, we've never seen a crucified person not die. And he stumbles into town. He shows up at Peter's door, and he says, here I am, and he faints. And Peter goes, oh, he's God. He's risen from the dead. No, he'll say, look, the poor man needs a doctor. Get a doctor. He's not going to think he's the resurrected Messiah, as David Strauss says. This concept is absolutely ludicrous. It makes no sense. That is the best refutation of the swoon theory. Look, we've been looking at the swoon theory. But remember, it wasn't just an empty grave. The disciples said they'd seen him, they'd touched him, they breathed him, they saw him ascend into heaven. Then they died for that personal claim. In fact, the actual disciples of the apostles, now the apostles had apostles, right? And we know who they are. Like the apostle of Peter was Clement of Rome. Clement of Rome says that Peter told him twice in his writings, he writes, Peter told me twice personally that he had seen the risen Christ. Similarly, Polycarp was a disciple of John. And Polycarp says John reiterated him 6 times that he had seen Christ risen. And I just want to think about how this happened. Here's Polycarp, and he's writing down something. He goes, John, you really saw him rise from there? John's like, dude, I've been burnt, I've been beaten, people are trying to kill me, and I have told you 3 times already that yes, I saw him risen from the dead. And Polycarp, like, are you sure? Like, Polycarp, what is wrong with you, man? Would we even be here if that was a lie? The minimum facts refute the swoon theory. So we know that the swoon theory just doesn't work. So that means we're left with the supernatural means. Now, we don't want to jump to the supernatural, but if you were here for the Agent X talk, we've already established it's more rational to think that God exists using science, that there are up to 6 supernatural dimensions using science. Remember that? We've already proven that. We've proven that Jesus existed using history, and the minimal facts are true using history and archaeology. Now, given all this and the elimination of other possible solutions, we're left to only one option. That the natural is not true, the supernatural is true, the resurrection happened, he is risen. He is risen indeed. And if you think about it, if the probable is impossible, then the probable is the only possibility. And if you summarize this, if God can create a universe creating matter, energy, and time out of nothing, then raising himself from the dead is an easy task. But only God can do it. Based on everything we've proved so far, this is the most logical and rational solution, and nobody else can prove otherwise. You can come up, I had somebody say, well, we don't know the answer. I said, no. We don't know the answer is not an answer. Like when I did with the Agent X talk. If I say, look, I'm the prosecution. Yeah, nobody saw the murderer do it, but we saw him running from the scene of the crime. He had a smoking gun. He owed the guy money. Witnesses heard his voice. And then you come up and say, well, Your Honor, we don't know if he really killed him. Maybe aliens did it. This is not an argument. This is a failure of an argument. If you want to propose an alternative, it is your job to tell me why my theory is wrong, not that there are other possible theories. It wouldn't work in a court of law. And what's interesting about this is, many years ago, I had this on my website as the case for the resurrection of Jesus, a case that can stand up in a court of law, right? And one fine day, I got a call from a bunch of attorneys at San Diego State University. And they're like, hi, we saw your, we're the Christian Lawyers Association or something like that at San Diego State. We saw your thing on your website. We'd like you to fly down and present it to us lawyers. I'm like, oh my goodness. I overspeak. I mean, I was just saying it, right? And so they fly me down and I give the presentation. And when I'm done, I said, so let me ask you this. Is my case sound? They said, absolutely, your case is sound. The only problem is I don't think that the judge will allow the evidence. And I said, why? He says, because it won't fit their narrative. Right? Oh, we're going to strike that from there. Why? Oh, because we can't. So if the improbable is possible, then if the probable is impossible, then the improbable must be possible. See, Christianity isn't a blind faith. It's a rational faith built on a solid historical and logical foundation. The grave was empty because Jesus Christ really rose from the dead. He is risen. And not only did the disciples claim that, but 500 people claimed that, including a Pharisee who was trying to kill him. Right? Paul. That would be like Hitler meeting God and becoming the most sanest and humanitarian Jew for the rest of his life. See, Jesus said, I am God, and I'll prove to you from rising from the dead. And he goes forward to prove that and makes the case that he is God. And as the Bible says, everything lies on this thing. If there is no resurrection of the dead, and Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain, and we of all people are fools. Right? But then that verse goes on to this. I mean, the question is, like, remember I said, is death the end game? Is this some convenient fantasy that we've created for ourselves? But that verse goes on to say, but Christ has indeed been risen from the dead, the first fruits of all who have fallen asleep. Christ proved that death is not the end game. Thank you. Any questions?